Welcome to First Answers. This is episode 2 in the series, A Parent's Guide to Gender Identity. Reviewing Erikson's 8 stages of identity can show us how identities develop over time. With this in mind, you can also learn what you can do to influence your children toward a healthy gender identity. Visit firstanswers.com to find more about the podcast and tons of resources for families and relationships.
In the podcast that preceded this one, I ended it by giving you the names of a series of stages. They're called psychosocial stages, authored by Erikson back in the 1950s. I'm doing that so that I can help you develop the concept of what an identity is and the fact that it develops gradually over time. Later on, I'm going to give you specifics about what behavioral scientists and what my clinical experience suggests you can do to promote a healthy gender identity. But for today, and for this podcast, I want to explain to you again, and I'm going to offer these stages a second time as a review so that you can remember the names, hopefully, and then when I go through each stage and describe what you can do to promote it, it'll make more sense. His stages are trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame, initiative versus guilt, industry versus inferiority, identity versus diffusion, intimacy versus isolation, generativity versus stagnation, and ego integrity versus despair. Then, because we, or I hope just not only me, are interested in identifying what parents might do, I'm going to include a brief suggestion or description what this model of identity suggests for you as parents. So, trust versus mistrust. If you want to promote trust, then you can provide a predictable, safe, and stimulating environment where there is predictable care and affection, and children can move around physically, eat, and so on, and respond to members of the family. In the next stage, which is called autonomy versus shame, autonomy is I can do it myself. I can do things on my own. Everything is okay. And shame is the feeling that children have when they're not permitted to do things on their own and to promote them successfully. So to promote autonomy, children learn to do things for themselves and by themselves. They understand the word mine and see themselves as different and somewhat unique from others. You can provide opportunities for your children to be involved with others, but also allow the child to play alone, make a few minor decisions, and show confidence in him. Stage 3, initiative versus guilt. Initiative means that I'm going to do things on my own and initiate in the world. Guilt, of course, is well known. Most of us have some guilt. But the guilt Erikson is talking about is a form of guilt that makes us worry about what other people think. We believe we're less than other people and so on. Now, to promote initiative, children experiment, try new things, take risks, and appear to enjoy learning. And you can ensure that you don't over-control, but instead provide mentoring where they share decision-making with you. You do some things together. And then you say to a child, you can do this, go forward, take care of it. Sometimes a child will say, no, I don't want to, and whine and complain. This is when you leave them alone and say, no, go ahead and try it out and see what you can do. The fourth stage, according to Erikson, is called industry versus inferiority. In this stage, children learn to work, produce, and other related skills, or they feel inferior. Now, at this point, I'd like to say to you that the research that has been done about Erikson's developmental stages tend to be really strong and supportive of the idea that if a child has trust instead of mistrust, his relationships with other people tend to be better. If a child has autonomy, he tends to be stronger and a little more confident. If he has initiative instead of guilt, then what happens is that he's more confident in himself, less worried about what other people do. One that I like particularly about children, late childhood, 11, 12, 13 to, 8 to 10 and 12 to so on, industry versus inferiority is that when kids function and perform and do chores and so on, they don't feel as inferior. And that has been well established by child development research. So you give kids their work. You can teach cooperative work at home. You can introduce children to experiment to find talents, provide time for them to finish. My experience is that most parents in our society nowadays do this pretty well. Then the next one is called identity, and its opposite is called diffusion. And in this case, children are comfortable within themselves and begin to demonstrate comfort with where they feel they belong around others and what they choose to do. And they also, when you have a strong sense of identity, desire to enjoy relationships with others. Now, when you don't, you have something called diffusion, which means confusion, no organization, can't lay a plan out, can't accomplish things, stick with them through the end, don't know who I am or what I'm about. And in my experience, we have more and more children who are reaching 14, 15, and 16 who are like that. And it's very difficult for them. And when it is that way, they don't want to take control of their life because there's too much responsibility sometimes. And they find it difficult to do that, so they resort to engaging in non-ignorable behavior. So you, as parents, will take control of them, or they will just drift and so on. And what that means is we have all these talented, wonderful adolescents who are not firmly fixed on the things they could do. Now, what follows identity, according to Erikson, is intimacy. And this form of intimacy is the idea of togetherness instead of isolation. And you could also apply that to physical and emotional intimacy between close friends and married people. Children as young adults seek emotionally intimate relationships and value friendships, marriage, and show strong affiliation ties with family members. And this form of intimacy in this stage people find highly rewarding. And when that's not the case, they isolate themselves, a lot of time in their rooms, a lot of times living alone, a lot of times preferring that. And then they develop some antisocial attitudes like everybody's an idiot or I can't trust this person or that person. So the idea of intimacy turns out to be really important for our children as well. Now, generativity is probably an unfamiliar term if you haven't studied much about developmental psychology. But what it means is that in the early 20s and 30s and 40s is when we generate, write books, get involved in our career work, develop and express our talents. In other words, generate, have our children and so on. And you might be listening to this and thinking, well, I'm in the period of generativity because I'm having children, or I'm past that because I'm grandparents and so on. Adults in this period tend to be very productive, often more productive than in other times of their lives, although that's no longer proven to be true because a lot of people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s are demonstrating their capacity to continue productivity. They write, invent, teach, and so on. And parents can show examples to their children of giving, helping others, being productive, and generally supporting your children's life. The last of Erikson's stages is called ego integrity or despair. And what he means by that is the idea that individuals are now older and are beginning to tell stories about their learned life lessons, involve themselves in finding a way to be positive about getting older and feeling satisfied with themselves. When that doesn't happen and people are old but disappointed about how they live their lives, he calls this despair. Now, here is the point of all this. He says something that is very significant to us because he proposed that there are conclusions, identity conclusions that people reach. And these are the kinds of conclusions that we should pay attention to when it comes to gender identity, because what happens is that some of our kids will form conclusions about themselves and regarding gender and will have difficulty. So, for example, He says there are 4 conclusions that individuals can make. One is called identity diffusion, which means that where gender is concerned, I don't know who I am. I might be 18 and thinking that I have same-sex attraction. I might be heterosexual. I might not be sure. I might be bisexual. I might be a variety of things, which is what happens to a lot of kids nowadays, and it's called identity diffusion. And when it comes time for kids to meet the task of their age, they're often unprepared and often confused. Now, the second conclusion that he proposes is called identity foreclosure. Now, this means that in some families and cultures, children are allowed very little freedom to choose for themselves who they will be or become. Now, where gender is concerned, think about this with me. If a child is having confusion or worries about his or her gender, they often never reveal it because they believe that they'll be condemned or criticized or ridiculed for it. And in those cases, those individuals can live years and years and years of their lifetime trying to hide what they believe to be true about themselves within themselves because they believe that family and society has foreclosed on them. And these individuals often suffer a great deal. And one of the reasons why they celebrate the idea of coming out is because they no longer feel foreclosed on. The third condition that Erikson talked about is called an identity moratorium, and I like this very much. It's like a recess where the processes of identity formation are suspended for a time, and then while this is going on, an individual engages in some life experiences that will help them be successful and gather more information about themselves. Sometimes when things are not going well and a child doesn't know for sure about themselves, parents will say, why don't you go here, live here with Aunt Jane, travel a little bit, work in this career, and give yourself some time to put things together. Gender identity doesn't typically allow that. It is so intense because gender is involved. And gender is a core issue of one's identity. If you're male, if you're female, if you're not, if you're one or the other, it's not ignorable. You have to address it. So you can't say, well, okay, I'm going to take a recess. What you can do, however, is to say to a child, don't foreclose on this right away. Let's talk and visit and open and take a look at some things. And in many instances, in my experience, children have thought they were, let's say, attracted to the same sex and discovered that some part of that's actually quite natural. It's not a bad thing, but what happens is they don't know enough about their own gender to be comfortable with it. And once they have more experiences with masculinity or femininity, they tend to live successful and so on. Now, here's the problem. We need to find out about this, long before that happens. So one of the purpose of this series is to invite you to become acquainted with gender-related issues, and then so that you will be able to tell others or yourself to identify gender-related identity formation early and promote its success. Now, the last type of conclusion that Erikson talked about is called identity achievement. And this is the state of being that includes a full, stable, and healthy identity. Here are the 4 again. Identity diffusion, which there's confusion. We don't know much about where we are and what we're doing. Foreclosure means somebody else has decided. Moratorium means we're going to take a recess. And identity achievement means I'm here. I'm pretty solidly organized and everything is fine. Now the question is, where do we go from here? What is it that is the best thing to do? I think you ought to review Erikson's description of identity formation and talk about the 8 stages, get them clearly in mind so that you can see how the stages develop year after year after year. Then take a look at your own experience and identify when, if you can, and what happened to help you be confident in your own sense of gender and to feel secure about it. It may help you also identify where you have some apprehensions about that. And in that case, you may want to go talk with somebody who you can ask questions to, a professional about gender, for example, and that person can help you do a moratorium or help you gain more knowledge and information so that you're more confident. Now, since anxiety in parents and children can disrupt the healthy course of identity, would you please examine where you are anxious, if you have those feelings, and where you are confident? Then start learning how to increase your confidence about helping to promote gender formation. And I'm going to do several other podcasts on this topic, and I hope that the ones I present will help give you that knowledge and help you be confident so that when you visit or think of people in terms of their gender, it's not embarrassing to you. You can look straightforwardly and objectively about it, and you might be able to help a grandchild or a child or somebody be successful in getting past the experiences where gender formation is not going well, and you could do things to help them be successful. I am motivated by this because I've seen both success and I've seen the lack of success. I promise you that promoting gender identity is so important to your children and to any child that it's something more of us ought to be aware of.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the First Answers podcast, which is sponsored by firstanswers.com, where you can find new tools for families and parents of 21st century kids, with a focus on emotional self-reliance. Find First Answers on Facebook, and remember to subscribe to stay up to date with new episodes. Give us a rating and write a review on the Podcasts app or Google Podcasts, and let us know what you think about First Answers. Check out another podcast by Dr. Scoresby called The Christ Questions, which is centered on questions we ask about Jesus Christ and questions he asks us. Dr. Scoresby examines how Christians can build faith in Jesus Christ that lasts and discover the true blessings and rewards for believing.